Good afternoon, everybody. If you hear me in the lobby, start coming in. If you hear me in the main room, have a seat. We're going to get to our last session here together. Tell you what, I've been through a lot of church business sessions over the years, and short and uneventful is best. Yeah, short and uneventful. That's what we're all hoping for with that. So, as you're coming in, it was mentioned earlier, I believe by Mickey, but in addition to my website, karlvaters.com, where I write at least once a week about small church issues, I also do have a podcast called The Church Lobby, and every 2 weeks I have a conversation with different church leaders, and we talk about issues in ministry, particularly as it relates to small churches. So if you listen to podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, it's available. And if you want to keep up with what we're doing in our ministry and just the new information that comes out, the new books as they come out, just subscribe. We have a free newsletter that we send out every Friday. So all the articles, all the podcasts, and any other news that happens around our ministry will all be in the Friday newsletter, and that is for free. And if you do subscribe to the newsletter, you'll then also get a link to every time we do a podcast, we do a little bit of bonus material with the guest, another 5 to 10, sometimes 15 minutes that is only available to subscribers. So again, just go to karlvaters.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and you can get all of that for free. As you are coming in, I've had several people ask as they've been at the book table, which books do what, which books should you get? You should get all of them, but in the meantime. First book I wrote was called The Grasshopper Myth. It's based on the book of Numbers where the 12 spies go into the land and 10 of them come back with a report. There were giants in the land. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes and we looked the same to them. So this is about getting over the discouragement of being a small church and a small church pastor, that there's value in small church pastoring. Most of my story is in here. So the first session, a lot of that is very similar to what was covered in this. My second book is Small Church Essentials, and this has got a wrench on the cover because this is really about tools to put in your hands that works especially in small churches. Some of the differences between big and small, so a lot of what we talked about in the second session, including the last chapter, has that Higgins boat story in Small Church Essentials. The third book is 100 Days to a Healthier Church, which hasn't sold as much as the other two because it came out in March 2020 and there was other stuff going on. But those who have been reading it recently and have been taking their churches through it, this is actually the one that I get the most comments on now. What it does is it takes a very intensive 100-day process to help your church start right from the beginning. What is it that our church is called to do? What is it that Jesus said his church is supposed to do? How well are we doing it? How can we get one step closer to healthier in a 100-day process? And then the final one is the Church Recovery Guide. This was written during what I thought was, the end of the pandemic, and it turned out to be about the middle of it. And it's about how to help your church come out of a time of crisis. It was written specifically during and for pandemic, but if you are in a church that has come through a period of crisis, that's a good one to get you started on that. The first 3 books are $12. This is a booklet, so it's 7 or all for $39. The first book, Grasshopper Myth, is also available in French and Spanish. And you can get the whole collection for $39. There's also an audiobook version of Small Church Essentials that you can buy and listen to the audiobook, and they're all available on Amazon on Kindle. But please don't buy it that way because these are heavy and I don't want to carry them all home. So just literally unburden me. That would really be appreciated. All right, let's take a look in this session at some post-pandemic issues. What's working in churches that are thriving. And before I do that, just a quick announcement. We mentioned those 4 books, but currently I'm working on book number 5. There we go. Desizing the Church. The subtitle is How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. What I did was, for the last few years, I've been looking around and wondering, how did we get to the point where we're so obsessed with bigness? These things don't come out of nowhere. It is not automatic that people like bigger things rather than small things. This came from somewhere. And so I've done the research and I've discovered where a lot of the bigness came from, especially here in America, and then how it got transported to other parts of the world. So how church growth became a science, then an obsession. How did we become obsessed with numerical growth? And then what are some alternatives to that? So it's a deep dive into history with a lot of alternatives there. And it's going to be coming out in April. Right now, we're in the middle of the very heavy middle editing phase of that, but we are well on target for our April 2nd release. So you can actually pre-order that now on Amazon. It's there and available for you to pre-order, and if you do, then you'll get it probably right on April 2nd. All right, let's move ahead. There are some events that change everything. World War II changed everything. In America, 9/11 changed everything. We now live in a post-9/11 world. And for any of you who travel on airplanes as much as we do, you know that it is different than it used to be. Now, it is the same thing with pandemic. Do you realize that the pandemic we went through and the shutdowns we went through, this is the first time since World War II that the entire world has endured a trauma all at the same time. The first globally experienced trauma since World War II. There have been bigger traumas since World War II. There have been genocides and wars and famines and earthquakes that have devastated regions, but they have been localized. 9/11 was a bigger trauma event than the pandemic, but it was localized to the US, and so it plays out differently. This is a long-term global trauma that we all experience together. It was fairly low level compared to the horrifying moments of 9/11, but because of how it lasted and how global it was, it has an impact that we're still trying to come to grips with today. But the bottom line is we live in a post-pandemic world. I know for a whole lot of us, we'd wish it was just like, let's just stop talking about it. And some folks might not even show up for this session because it was like, pandemic, I don't want to hear about it. But we have to acknowledge it. We have to recognize the world that we live in now is different, and we need to understand how it's different. So what I want to walk through in this session is some of the things that I've learned, mostly, not because I'm smart, but mostly because the position that the Lord has put us in over the last few years, spending so much time doing this, where we travel so much to every segment of the country, every denomination you can name, over a dozen other countries, and I'm constantly having conversations with as wide and a variety of the body of Christ as anybody I know. And so I'm getting a lot of input. And so I've just become like a funnel to be able to process this and to be able to pass it on to you. So let's take a look, first of all, at some keys to post-pandemic recovery. Key number one is this: don't try to go back to what was. I'm still talking to too many pastors whose entire goal is we just want everybody back the way it was in the good old days of 2019. Our window for nostalgia has gotten really short lately, hasn't it? Right? Here's the deal. You cannot go back to that. You can never go back in time anyway. But there's been such a shift of mentality, such a shift in our culture. Things are so different now that you cannot go back in any way to the way it used to be. Not to those attitudes, not to those people who used to be in the seats. I've got news for you, bad news for you, but we've got to come to grips with it. The folks who have not come back since they left during the shutdowns, if they're not back yet, they're not coming back. It's time to move forward. I know as pastors' hearts, we see them as the lost sheep, and we want to go after the lost sheep, leave the 99 and go after the lost sheep. But here's the deal. At this point, if they haven't come back, they're less like the lost sheep and more like the prodigal son. The sheep didn't intend to get lost, so the shepherd went to find the sheep. The prodigal left intentionally, so the father did not run after the son. The father was available for the son when the son came back. The father met him halfway. But the son had to make a heart change to come back. So in the meantime, we need to look around and realize, there's these folks that we know and love, and that I was just talking to a couple of you who still come to the church when they have needs. So we're still ministering, we're still pastoring, we're still blessing them, and we should. But let's not go chasing after them, because we can put the same amount of time and energy and effort into people who have not chosen not to come to your church. They just don't know it's there. The folks who used to be in your church and have chosen not to come, the reason they're not coming back isn't because they don't know that you're there and they don't know what time the services are and they don't know how good your stuff is. They know and they're choosing not to come. But there's a whole bunch more people, the fields are white unto harvest, who do not know that, who have not made that conscious choice. And that's where we need to be putting our energies. Don't try to go back to what was. There's a reason why our rear view mirrors are 8 inches wide and our windshields are 6 feet wide. Because that's about the percentage that we should be aiming forward and looking back. Yes, we should look back. We are building on the scriptures. We're building on 2,000 years of church tradition. All of that informs who we are today and helps us as we move forward. But that's the glance back. You cannot drive a car looking through the rearview mirror. It doesn't work that way. We've got to move forward. So don't try to go back to what was. So if we're not going to go back to what was, what should we do? Point number 2, build on what you're learning. Build on what you're learning. My dad taught me this. When I was a teenager, I grew up for a few years in Modesto, California. It's dead center of the state. If you've ever seen a topographical map of California, there's a big valley straight down the middle of the state, and it's one of the richest agricultural valleys in the world. In fact, California manufactures, grows, and sells more agricultural product than any other state. People don't realize that. They think it's just high tech in California. More agricultural products, more stuff is grown in California than any other state. Everything from almonds and walnuts to oranges and lemons and grapefruit and peaches and strawberries. Yes, we are literally the land of fruits and nuts. And in the middle of the state, there's this small town called Modesto, California, which the biggest business in town is Gallo Winery. That's where Gallo comes from, the biggest winemaker in the country. And when I was a teenager, I got a job at a peach processing plant, night shift. And so that I showed up for the night shift, and peaches go through a washer, then a splitter, then a pitter, and then they came to me. So they wash them, they cut them in half, they take the pit out, and then they come to me, and my job was to see all of these half peaches, and whichever ones had a little bit of a pit still left in them, I pick them up, take the pit out, put it back on the belt, and it would go. Now, what I didn't realize is the first time you're ever on a conveyor belt or working on a conveyor belt, for the first hour or two, the belt is moving, but after about an hour or two, sometimes less, it feels less like the belt is moving and more like you're moving. Creates a real sense of vertigo. It turns out, I found out later, that the old timers had a pool on which one of the new kids would go down first. Apparently someone else went down before me, because when my supervisor saw me wavering, she pulled me aside, sat me down, and said, get your stomach back again, and when you do, come find me. And for the rest of the night, she put me on the end of the line where my job was to pull the rotten peaches out of the barrel. That was my first night. So I got home about 7 a.m. as my dad was heading off to work, and he said, "So how was your first night at work?" And I said, "It's terrible, and I hate it." He said, "Yeah, but what did you learn?" I said, "I learned that it's terrible and I hate it. Didn't know that yesterday, I know that now." Okay. Next morning, same question. "It's terrible and I hate it. What else did you learn?" "Don't want to do this for the rest of my life." Okay. Next morning, "What did you learn?" "Terrible and I hate it. Don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Probably ought to do better in school so that I can get a better job than this, so I don't have to do this for the rest of my life." And then I went, ding, I see where Dad's going with this. I learned a lot at that job, including the fact that repetitive labor is not necessarily unskilled labor. The people who do that work for us deserve a lot more respect than we usually give them. A lot of other things like that. But my dad taught me this: build on what you're learning. If you go through a painful experience and you don't learn something from it, then all you've got is the painful experience. We've been through a painful experience. I lost friends. But I am determined to take more out of what we've been through than it took out of me. I am determined. And the only way I can take more out of the last several years than the last several years took out of me is to learn everything I can from it. And the only way to do that is we've got to have a shift of mindset. If we will look at it correctly, what we will discover is that year and a half or so of intense stuff That year and a half where everything was written with such bold, bright colors in front of our eyes, just about every day for a while, it seemed like there was another major headline that was just earth-shattering. But everything was, I'm convinced, pandemic changed nothing. It just accelerated and amplified changes that were already in place. It wrote stuff out that used to be subtle in big, bold colors, so you can't miss it now. If we will look at that season, what we will see is we had about a year and a half in which, if we'll look at it this way, we can gain about 10 years worth of leadership lessons because of how intense it was. So we can look at it and go, I just want to forget about it and get nothing out of it and just have the pain. Or we can look back at it and go, okay, what did we learn from this? Because you can get 10 years worth of leadership out of that year and a half, and it's still not too late to take a look back and learn from that. We need to build on what we're learning. And then thirdly, define your current reality. Define your current reality. I was talking to a pastor recently at an event like this, and he was talking about how his church has been since post-pandemic. I said, how has it been? He said, well, we've been a church of 140 for a lot of years, and only about 90 folks have come back. And he said, actually, a month or so ago, I told all of our volunteers, I said, we need to adjust our mindset about this. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, I told them, we are no longer a church of 140. We are no longer going to act like a church of 140. We are no longer going to do programs like a church of 140 because we're not. We're a church of 90. I said, what does that mean for you? He says, it's actually been very helpful. It's actually lightened our load. I said, how is that? He said, well, first of all, you're not putting 50% more effort into things that we should, putting together 50% more programs, expecting 50% more people to show up than we do. We've got an accurate assessment of what's going on. But he said, secondly, the biggest thing is this. He said, at 90 right now, if we were to grow by 10 this year, and we were still perceiving ourselves as a church of 140, we could grow by 10 and still see ourselves as down by 40. He said, at 90, we could grow by 50%. We could add 45 people, go to 135 people, and if we still considered ourselves a church of 140, we could grow by 50% and still consider ourselves down by 5. That's not healthy. He said, we're not 140, we're a church of 90. So if we grow by 50%, woohoo, we grew by 50%. And that's not pretending, that's reality. The other one's pretending. So for a lot of us, I've talked to several of you already about the post-pandemic downturn in congregational attendance. You are not what you were. Lay that aside, it's gone. And it's not depressing and it's not anything negative to assess where you are right now. It's been said, and I believe it absolutely profoundly to be true, that the first job of leadership is to define reality. The first job of leadership is not to cast a vision. The first job of leadership is not to get followers. The first job of leaders is to define reality. The picture I gave you this morning of the Apollo 13 table, everything that's on this table is everything that's on Apollo 13. That is an amazing leadership moment. They defined their reality. This is what we have to work with. Now what? So as pastors, as church leaders, we need to define our current reality. You are not what you were. You are what you are. Start from here. So those are the first 3 keys. But now I've got some bad news for you. This will happen again. Not necessarily a pandemic. I have no idea. I'm not a prophet. But we live in a broken world where bad things happen. You don't need to go further than Genesis 3 to know that. It's one of the reasons that I'm a Christian is because the biblical worldview that God made a perfect world and we broke it is the only thing that makes sense. Our sin broke the perfect world God gave us. The scripture tells us that by chapter 3. And it's the only thing that makes sense of the world as it is, right? We live in a broken world where bad things happen, which means it's not a matter of if another emergency or difficult season is coming, but what and when. There's going to be a tornado or a flood or a drought, or where I live in California, an earthquake followed by a drought, followed by a flood, followed by a fire, followed by the actor strike, followed by who knows. We live in a broken world where bad things happen. So here's the deal. We've gone through a difficult season, and we can look at it and go, okay, what did we do well that we can learn from and build on for the next difficulty? What did we do badly that we can learn from and do better during the next difficulty? Because again, it's not if another bad season is coming, but what is coming and when. This will happen again. So with that in mind, let's take a look at 4 lessons that I learned from the conversations I had. I talked to so many churches, and as I talked to them, I started seeing patterns emerge. And there were 4 key areas that made the biggest difference between churches on this side that struggled and some of that did not even survive, and churches on the other side that didn't just survive but thrived. 4 key areas of difference. So let me walk you through them. Churches that thrived during and after the pandemic, first of all, had resources in reserve. They had resources in reserve. Churches that were operating right at the edge of things got overwhelmed by the pandemic, and they couldn't deal with it. One of the areas was resources in reserve financially. Our church for decades operated like a typical small church, which is, we were month to month on our budget and sometimes week to week. And after I'd been there about 15 years, I thought, you know what? Not only am I tired of this, but I don't think this is good stewardship. I don't think this is God honoring that we're desperate for an offering this Sunday or we can't pay our bills. So I said, what I want to do is I want to put 10% of our undesignated fund offerings into a contingency fund, 10% per month until we have 3 months of budget sitting in a contingency fund that we can go to in a time of an emergency. I said, if we do that every month, it'll take us 2.5 years to get there. We'll give ourselves 3 years to get there. It took us 10 years. Why? Because we're a small church with a small church budget. And 1 month we didn't have enough, and the next month we had enough, and then the following month the water heater broke. But we kept at it. It took us 10 years. And that 10-year point happened about 7 or 8 years ago. So when the pandemic hit, we didn't panic at all. We had the instant drop of income because people couldn't physically be in the building. We had a rise of costs and expenses because of all the things that were going on. And we didn't panic for a moment because we had 3 months money in contingency fund. It's not just finances, though. It's also the resources, our personal resources. Pastors and small church pastors especially, we work way too many hours. Here's what I strongly recommend. If you are a full-time pastor of a small church, do not schedule yourself to work more than 25 hours per week. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying don't work more than 25 hours a week. I'm saying don't schedule yourself to work more than 25 hours a week. Why? Because you know that 25 to 30 hours of work is going to hit you that you did not plan for. And the smaller the church, the more true that is. Our big church friends can plan for 40 and work 45 because there's very little extra stuff that hits them because of the staff, because of the nature of the way it is. But in a small church, you know you're going to get a call, right? And it's all of a sudden going to overwhelm you. And if you've already planned to work 40 to 50 and then another 25 to 30 hit you, a lot of us are consistently working 70, 80, 90-hour work weeks. This is not sustainable. It's not healthy. It's not right. It's not godly. And I know there's some people who are going, well, the devil doesn't take a rest. Well, you need a better role model. Jesus took naps constantly. Right? And the more difficult it got, the more he took a break away. We need to follow Jesus' example. He constantly took a break. So that gives us resources in reserve when difficult seasons hit, because they will hit. So plan for it. Secondly, team-based leadership. When the pandemic first hit, I got 2 separate emails. When I got the second one, I thought, oh, this must have just been a resend of the first one. But I looked back and went, oh no, it's 2 different people with almost exactly the same email. And it was this. I've got people volunteering to help me in my church now who've never volunteered before because of all that's going on. I don't know what to have them do because I do everything. There's too many of us as pastors who do everything. Now, I get it. There are seasons in a small church where you have to. We've had seasons where I had to do everything for now, but it has to be a season. It can't be a habit. We've always got to be, we talked about it earlier, discipling others to start taking that load. The churches that had team-based leadership, when new people stepped up to help out, they had a team to put them on. And even before that, when the crisis hit, it landed on multiple shoulders. We, through Zoom, got together with multiple people. We'd have 12, 13, instead of just one pastor with it all on their shoulders. And everybody contributed and everybody had ideas. And the team was already in place. Team-based leadership, we talked about it earlier with the pastoral prime mandate, right? To equip God's people. It's biblical. So, resources in reserve, team-based leadership. The third big difference was adaptability. Churches that had been static already had a hard time, and some of them were not able to adapt to the new environment when things changed. Churches that had been regularly adapting to new things, that already had a process in place that we talked about earlier, this was just a bigger change, but they were already used to the idea of adapting to new circumstances, and they did much better, right? I'm gonna, again, over-stereotype a situation to draw a point for you. But there are some folks out there who look at it and go, okay, it's only legitimate church. They got the destination mindset we talked about earlier. It's only church if we meet in this building at this time with this denominational tag, singing these songs, wearing these clothes, having this class. And the more items you add to the must-have list for it to be church, the more vulnerable you make your church. Because when all of a sudden the pandemics hit, and in California, we had longer lockdowns than any other state. We were 6 months before we worshiped in our building. We had 6 months of worship outside in the parking lot. Now we're in California, so we could do it even through the winter, but nevertheless, we had 6 months where we were worshiping outside, okay? But here's the deal. There are the churches that had to be all of these things. All of a sudden, we're panicked when all of a sudden they can't meet in this building at this time, singing these songs. You know, when all of a sudden they couldn't do that, that was where all kinds of people started running around going, they closed down the churches, they closed down the churches. I can't believe they closed down the churches. Here's the reality. Not a single governor closed a single church. They don't have that power. Don't make them think they do. We closed down the building for 6 months. But my response to the governor of California is, that's fine. We don't need no stinking buildings. If you think you got to have a building to have church, you need a better theology of church. We don't need it. Our church couldn't be in the building for 6 months. We didn't stop having church for 1 second. Because we already had a process in place. We were already used to adapting to things when they changed. Be a church that's already adapting. It's like when you're playing a sport, don't just stand there static, right? What do coaches teach you? Always be moving, always be on the balls of your feet. Be ready for whatever might come at you. Because if you start from nothing, you will not get to the ball in time. Be adaptable. And then fourth, unity. Unity. The biggest heartbreak for me out of pandemic, and I say this very carefully because I lost friends. The biggest heartbreak for me at a pandemic was that while the culture around us was at each other's throat, the church, instead of providing an alternative of unity, looked just like the culture. And those of you who pastored through it know it, because you couldn't make a single decision without having somebody disagree very, very violently, emotionally violently, hopefully not physically violently. Right? Here's this situation. And what also happened with the unity thing was fascinating was this. There are a lot of churches out there that thought they were unified, but it turned out they only agreed on politics, or they only agreed on a certain style of church, or they only agreed on having basically a single ethnic mix, or they only agreed on a common history. And here's the thing. If your church is united around anything other than Christ and Him crucified, the center is not strong enough to hold. I pastor in California, so we have everybody from every side in our congregation every Sunday. We've got pro-mask, anti-mask, pro-vax, anti-vax, Republican, Democrat, you name it, they're in the room. We didn't have a single argument during the entire thing. Why? Because we kept reminding them, we're here on mission with Jesus, everything else is secondary. Anything else will not hold. The challenge becomes, how do we get our churches back to a place of unity when it seems like everybody is at each other's throat lately? How do we get there? Well, let me see if I can walk you through some of that in a way that might help. I have a friend named Lori Andrews. Lori is a pastor's wife, and she has a doctorate in education with an emphasis in neurobiology. Neurobiology being the study of how our brains work. So in the middle, or what I thought was in the middle of the pandemic, and it turned out to be fairly close to the beginning, I called her up and said, hey, I've got some questions about what we're all going through. What happens to our brains when we're experiencing the trauma like we're experiencing? And her first response was, oh, thank you for using the T word. I said, T word? She said, trauma. You're the first pastor I've talked to who acknowledges that what we're going through is trauma. I said, well, I guess that's my first question then. Is what we're experiencing trauma? And she said, yes. We are all experiencing multiple levels of severe trauma. I said, so what happens to our brains when we go through trauma? She told me a bunch of things, but the one thing that stood out for me was this. First of all, do you realize that the brain is the only organ in our bodies that doesn't operate mechanically? Our lungs, our liver, our heart all operate mechanically, right? They move stuff in and out. Our arms move back and forth. The only organ that doesn't move, in fact, if it does move, that's a problem, is our brains. So how does it operate if it's not moving? This is a huge computer with exchanges of electricity. And the way it operates is that electricity moves from one place to the other. When we eat, we bring energy in, and that energy converts into electricity, and that electricity fuels our brain. But there's only so much electricity that the brain can hold. So when we have emergency traumatic experiences, it can't bring in more electricity. It has to transfer electricity from one part of the brain to other parts of the brain. Make sense? So my friend told me when our brains are experiencing trauma, one part of our brain goes dark because almost all the energy leaves there, and two parts of our brain light up like a Christmas tree. She says what goes dark is the logic centers. In a trauma, in an emergency, our logic centers go dark. Why? Because when you're running from a bear, you don't need to think about philosophy. So the brain goes, don't need you here, need you over here. And where does it go? Action and emotion. They light up like crazy. Get me out of here! Action, emotion. If you've ever been through a traumatic experience, an accident, a death of a family member, especially something sudden, you know what I'm saying right now, you're registering and going, oh. If you've ever helped people through trauma, you've experienced it. I remember years ago, I was by the bedside of a friend and whose spouse passed away. And as soon as the spouse passed away, the doctor came in and explained what had happened and why and what steps to do next. And a couple hours later, after we were still grieving together, she turned to me and she goes, is the doctor ever going to show up and tell us what to do or what happened? I was like, we just had that entire conversation and I was right here with you. We did? I don't remember that. Why? Because it was so thick in the trauma, her logic centers couldn't process it. My friend told me this, so much energy leaves our logic centers during trauma that people in trauma can't hear explanations. When you are in trauma, you are literally incapable of processing new information. It's not possible. In fact, they've discovered that during trauma, one of the things your brain does is that there's actually a membrane in your ears, and that membrane enlarges to block out some of your hearing. Have you ever watched a movie, for instance, where a trauma happens and all of a sudden, from the point of view of the person who experienced the trauma, all of a sudden they're barely hearing mumbling and it's really quiet, and then after a while, when they come to, then it starts getting louder and they can hear again? That's not just a theatrical hack. That is the way people, their hearing literally diminishes. Why? Because that energy needs to go somewhere else. And any extra information is just clutter. And so it all simplifies to dealing with the trauma right now. So it's amazing. So I said, but here's the deal. All these people are in trauma and they can't process new information. They can't hear explanations, but explaining stuff is what I'm good at. That's what they're asking me to do when they show up on Sunday, is explain this. What do I do when people do eventually show up on Sunday? And she said this, make your worship service longer and your preaching shorter. This is during the height of trauma. I said, why is that? She said, we do not heal, when we're in trauma, we do not heal by processing new information because we can't do it. We heal by doing familiar things with familiar people in familiar places. With a physical, that's why when you're in trauma, what do you want to do? You want to hug somebody. You want to cry with someone and put your head on their shoulder. You want to go somewhere with people you know and love and trust. In fact, there's 3 big things that help our brains heal when we're tired or traumatized: music, stories, and friends. Think about it at the end of the day when you're exhausted. Do you want to prepare a sermon or read a textbook? No. At the end of the day, what do you want to do? You want to watch TV or a movie, stories, read a novel, stories, listen to music, or hang out with friends. Why? Because stories and music and friendships refuel a tired brain. They heal a traumatized brain. And let me think. On Sunday morning when we gather together, what do? Oh yeah, we sing songs of worship to Jesus, we hear the stories from Scripture, and we do so in a room full of friends. It's almost like Jesus knew what we needed at the end of a busy week. And especially in the small church, that is our superpower. The thing that people need to heal, even neurobiologically, even if you don't believe in God, which I'm assuming everybody here does, me too. But even if you don't believe in God, neurobiologically, this shows the evidence of God's design in us. Right? This is what God wants us to do. So they need familiarity and stability because they can't hear explanations. So from that now, let me make a quick shift to something else. In 1969, actually, it's a continuation, but it's a new part of it. In 1969, a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book called On Death and Dying. And I believe that when she wrote that book, she gave a gift to the world. If you have never heard of her name or heard of the name of her book, you know her work. Because if you've ever heard the phrase, "you're in denial," that's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. What Kubler-Ross did was she discovered how God made our brains to recover from trauma and loss by going through 5 distinct but overlapping phases: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Most of you have heard some of this already, right? So a bad thing happens, the first thing is denial. Oh, that can't be. And then the second thing becomes anger. Oh, that shouldn't be. And then we move into bargaining. Okay, maybe if I do this and this, I'll make it so that it won't be. And then depression. Oh no, it really is. I'll never get out of this. And then acceptance. Okay, now what? What's the way forward? My earlier, oh no, so what, now what, is the last 3 phases of that. I was going through it and didn't know it, right? This is the way God made us to recover. Now, here's the challenge. Especially in the summer of 2020 into early 2021, there were so many traumas hitting us at such a fast pace. The first thing hit us, and we're starting to recover from that. And then another thing, and we're starting to recover from that. And then another, and then another. At a certain point in late 2020, early 2021, we were in all 5 stages of recovery on 7 or 8 major traumas. And at a certain point, our brains just go, that's it, I'm tapping out, I am not doing this anymore. That's all subconscious. But what I noticed happening was this. Instead of these being stages that we worked through, they ended up being campsites where we sat. Now, the reason this happened during pandemic differently than any other trauma we've recently faced is this. As I said earlier, people in trauma want to do familiar things in familiar places with familiar people, right? 9/11, that evening, every church in America was open. Why? We needed to be there. During pandemic, what happened? That resource, that ability to do that was closed off. For week after week after week in California, for month after month after month. So our place to go to recover emotionally was cut off. So we stayed in this place of suspended animation for far too long, and a lot of us have come out of it and just gone, I just don't want to think about it anymore, rather than actually dealing with it. So we've got a lot of folks in our congregations who've never dealt with it because the avenue to deal with it was cut off during the height of the trauma, and they've never revisited it to help heal from it. Okay, so that's where we're in this interesting and strange situation. So what I noticed was we tap out on our brains and then we look at it and we go, okay, subconsciously what we do is, I'm not processing through these 5 anymore. I'm gonna pick one and I'm just gonna live there. So let me put up on the screen now the 5 of them again, but I'm going to put them up not as stages that we walk through, but as individual places where we land. And I'll go through them alphabetically this way because it's not going to be in that order. So alphabetically, first one is acceptance. There are some acceptors in your life. These are the people whose favorite saying is, well, it is what it is. Can't change it, might as well live with it, right? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they either blow up or they disappear, and you go, what happened? I thought they were okay. These are the volcanoes that will refuse to blow, refuse to let off steam, right? Be careful of the acceptors. Watch out for them and give them a chance to let off some steam. Second one is anger. These are the people whose almost every word lately has been, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And God bless them, there's plenty of fuel for that fire. There's a lot to be angry about. But have you noticed there's some people who used to be reasonable who are angry about everything now? That's not a conscious choice. It's a subconscious defense mechanism. Thirdly, bargaining. These are the fixers. These may be your best volunteers in the church. Be careful that they're not burning themselves out trying to fix interior problems by doing exterior work. I've made some of them take Sundays off against their own will because I'd rather lose them for a couple of weeks than lose them for good. Make them take breaks. Fourthly, denial. These are the people that go around going, everyone's lying. I don't trust anybody anymore. Nobody in church, nobody in politics, nobody in the government, nobody in business. They're all lying, except this one guy on YouTube. Let me send you a link. He's got it all figured out. What's going on? And these were reasonable people before. Again, it's trauma. It's easier to say everybody's lying than to try to process through the whole thing. And then the final one is depression. Years ago, they used to say that people had a fight or flight response. And I used to hear that, and I didn't know which one I was because I didn't feel like either one of them applied to me. And then about 20 years ago, they said, it's actually not fight or flight, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And I went, oh, they found me. That's me. I'm the freeze guy. I'm the deer in the headlights. Okay? That's depression. Okay? When I am in that way, like the 40 days that I took off earlier that I told you about, during that 40 days, I did not spend that 40 days in prayer and fasting. I didn't. I spent that 40 days watching TV and eating ice cream. Right? Depressed, right? During pandemic, same kind of thing. Depression is my go-to. But while I'm sitting there, deer in the headlights, my brain is trying to figure it out. And then when I figure some of it out, then I go to bargaining and I come here to fix your problems. I know this about myself, but because I know this about myself, now I can process it because I'm aware of it. So, up until now, we're looking at this and we're wondering, okay, who's got what's going on, and you've all identified somebody in your life that's somewhere, right? Here's the thing. First of all, do not just go to them and tell them, okay, I figured you out. You're angry and here's why. Do not do that. Before you address their problem, recognize your own trauma first. We're all experiencing it. Which one is your default? Bargaining, depression, anger, acceptance? What is it? And if you're sitting there thinking, none of those are me, welcome to denial, folks. Right? We all are susceptible to this. Recognize your own trauma first, and then don't let your trigger become your truth. Don't let your trigger become your truth. What do I mean by that? We are all triggered by certain things, but our triggers are tied to our emotional state. And our value system is something different, and that's where our truth is found. Our trigger is in our emotional state. Our truth is in our value system. Right? Romans 7, the Apostle Paul is having an internal battle between his trigger, the thing I don't want to do that I keep doing, and his value system, God's law that I know I should be obeying and that I really want to obey. And your trigger, the thing that triggers you, is not related to your value system. And anybody who's been married more than 6 weeks knows this. Because the biggest fights you and your spouse have had have not been over your value system. It's been over your emotional state. But when we're high emotionally, we convince ourselves that this is the most important thing to me, that this is what I value. Or when we see somebody else reacting extremely, we think that must be what's the most important thing to them. No, it's not. It's their trigger. Don't confuse the two. Now, I want you to take these ideas and we're going to add this little piece, okay? There's a phenomenon out there called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And from bottom to top, you get higher and higher in confidence. From left to right, you get more and more knowledgeable and far more experienced, okay? So it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is how it's gonna go. It's gonna go like this. Now, what happens is you start bottom left, and I don't know anything about this subject, and I know I don't know anything about this subject, so I'm ignorant and I have no confidence. And then I go to Bible college, or I read a book, or I watch a YouTube video, and all of a sudden, I'm convinced I've got all the answers, and our confidence skyrockets with just a little bit of experience, and we go to what's called Mount Stupid. This is not my name for it. That's what Dunning and Kruger call it, right? Mount Stupid, what it means. Mount means I'm really confident about this. Stupid means I really don't know much about it, but I'm really confident that I do. Do not raise your hand on this, but how many of you know someone who's right on Mount Stupid, right? But here's the deal. Some people just stay there and go, that's it, I know enough, I'm set. But if you have enough humility to go, I'm gonna keep learning, here's what happens almost immediately. Again, first year Bible college student comes out, I'm gonna tell everybody how to fix this. First year in actual pastoring, all of a sudden what happens? They drop down to the next segment, which is called the Valley of Despair, right? You go from, I've got this thing locked, I got my ordination papers here, I've got my graduation certificate, I'm gonna show up in this church and tell them what for, and 18 months later, you visit them and they're like, oh, I know what he told me it would be like this. This is so hard, I don't think I can do it. They're in the Valley of Despair because they got enough experience to know this is really hard. Too many pastors quit right here. And I think if they knew this, they wouldn't, or fewer would. The Valley of Despair is normal. Once you get hit square in the face with reality and it's more difficult and more complicated than you thought, I don't know if I can do this. But if you keep learning, coming out of the humility that we earned through the Valley of Despair, what we go through is what they call the slope of enlightenment. At this point, you are learning at the same pace as your confidence is increasing. And that's sustainable. My confidence increases as my knowledge increases, and it makes sense until you get to a thing called the plateau of stability, which is where I know what I know, I'm aware of what I don't know. I'm gonna tell you right now, in pastoral ministry, I now live on the plateau of stability. I'm not super smart, I'm not smarter than everybody else. I have way more experience than I used to have. I have way more knowledge than I used to have. But I've been doing this long enough to know that there's a big gap, they call it the confidence gap, between me now and me when I was on Mount Stupid. I will never be that confident or arrogant again. But in all of our churches, you may be at the plateau of stability, but somebody on Mount Stupid is gonna go, are you gonna do this or are you gonna do that? And you go, actually, it's a little more complicated than that, and immediately they think you're compromising. Right? How many times? I've had people in my own family do stuff on Facebook. Well, if a pastor does this, leave that church. They don't know what they're doing. And I try to go, it's more complicated than that. And they're like, yeah, but if you knew. And I'm like, you haven't pastored a day in your life. I've been pastoring for 40 years. Stop it. It's harder than that. But no, they're going to sit there and throw rocks at people on the plateau of stability. And when we get there, we just have to realize that that's part of what we're going to be dealing with. Now, when you superimpose this onto these 5 different places where people might be staying, sitting in anger, sitting in depression, sitting in denial or whatever, you can imagine now how it's coming together. Does this now explain a whole lot of the interpersonal, emotional turmoil that's going on within your churches and families and communities now? If we take this home, there's a lot in this that we can unpack and really help. So what do we do about this? Here's what we do. Address the underlying fear, not the symptomatic behavior. Like I said earlier, do not go home to Mr. Anger and say, hey, I found out why you're angry and here's why. Will not work well. Don't go to the depressed person and go, you're depressed and here's why. It doesn't work well. It'll push him into further depression. What you do is you take him out for coffee and you just ask them questions that have absolutely nothing to do with politics or science or medicine or the pandemic or the church or religion or theology. You just sit down and you have a conversation, but you subtly start asking them questions that will help uncover what are they really afraid of. And then address the fear. All of this is a defense against fear, right? The scripture tells us this over and over and over again, right? For 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given us a fear, but of power and of love and of a sound what? That's our brain. God cares about our brain, our minds. Love, right? Fear is the enemy of a sound mind. The antidote to fear is power, knowing that God is in charge. Love, knowing that he loves us and that we have people in our lives that we love and who love us. And this will bring a sound mind. This will bring sanity back to us and to the people that we're leading. All right? And let me conclude with this one last simple little statement. When times are normal, leaders inspire change. For 40 years, as I've been in ministry, I have been taught almost every time I've gone to a conference how to bring change to a stuck church, how to motivate an apathetic church. Anybody think that we need to bring more change to anybody anymore? We are not in a place where we need more change. We have lived through 40 years about as normal, about as stable, and about as safe as a society can get. We can all point to difficult seasons, that always happens. But we've had about as 40 stable years as a culture can get. And so we had to get people motivated and moving and changing and unapathetic. Now everybody cares way too much about everything. So we have to shift that. So let's go back to that again. When times are normal, leaders inspire change, but times aren't normal anymore. So what's the next one? When times are disruptive, leaders provide stability. This is a new skill set. I've been trained how to bring change. I have not been trained how to bring stability through disruption. But that's what our churches are going to need for the next 5 to 10 years minimum.